I waited 40 years after Elvis's passing, and almost 40 years, and so I never wanted to be accused of capitalizing or exploiting my relationship with him. So that's why I never wrote a book for almost 40 years about my relationship with not everything in my life in that book. There are some things that are better left unsaid.
Elvis Presley was the undisputed king of rock and roll, an untouchable god wrapped in high-collared capes and blinding rhinestones. But behind the iron gates of Graceland, away from the screaming crowds, lived a deeply fragile, isolated man. At 76 years old, Linda Thompson is breaking down the final wall. For nearly 5 years, she lived as his shadow, his confidant, and his full-time caretaker, holding his hand in the dark when the nightmares came. Now, she is ready to share the raw, heartbreaking truth about the real Elvis Presley that the public never truly knew. It wasn't a story of plastic perfection, but a gritty account of dependency, devotion, and survival. The Midnight Meeting. The sticky July humidity of 1972 hung heavy over the parking lot of the Memphian Theater. It was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. Linda Thompson sat in the fourth row of the plush, empty auditorium, adjusting the strap of her high-heeled sandals. She was 22, freshly crowned as Miss Tennessee, and used to bright television studio lights. Tonight, she sat in total darkness. A heavy emergency exit door at the side of the stage groaned open. A group of large, broad-shouldered men in identical black leather jackets entered the room first. They walked down the aisles with flashlights, checking the empty rows. Then came Elvis. He wore a dark blue knit tracksuit and his signature oversized amber sunglasses, even though there wasn't a single light bulb turned on in the house. He walked straight toward Linda, sat in the vacant seat right next to her, and leaned close. He pointed toward the blank silver screen and whispered a dry joke about the upcoming feature film. The public believed Elvis spent his nights hosting wild, crowded Hollywood parties, surrounded by starlets and champagne. But his actual daily routine was incredibly small. He lived as a complete prisoner of his own fame, unable to walk down a public sidewalk in the daylight without causing a near riot. To survive, he spent thousands of dollars renting out entire bowling alleys, roller rinks, and movie theaters in the middle of the night. What was the immediate spark that drew this young, small-town pageant queen to the most famous entertainer on the planet? The answer lay in the very first topic he brought up once the movie started rolling. Elvis didn't boast about his gold records, his custom private jets, or his sold-out international concerts. Instead, he began talking about his late mother, Gladys. He described the small, two-room shotgun house in Tupelo where he grew up. He admitted that despite all the money in his bank accounts, he felt completely abandoned. Linda listened in silence. She realized that the cool, confident king of rock and roll was actually a deeply grieving, insecure country boy. By the time the theater projectionist finally shut off the machines at 6 o'clock in the morning, Elvis had rested his head in her lap. He asked her if she would accompany him back to Graceland that very morning. He didn't offer a luxurious courtship or a slow introduction to his life. He simply told her that he couldn't face the quiet halls of his mansion alone. Linda agreed to get into the back of his black limousine. She arrived at the famous music gates of Graceland just as the sun was beginning to peek over the Memphis treetops. The fans were already lining up along the stone wall, clutching old album covers and cameras. They screamed as the car slid past the security booth. Linda looked out the dark tinted windows at the crowd. She felt a sudden, sharp chill. She realized that entering Elvis's world meant leaving her own normal life behind on the gravel driveway. She wasn't just stepping into a historic mansion, she was volunteering to become the primary emotional anchor for a man who was slowly being crushed by the weight of his own public image. The fairy tale was beginning, but the rules of the kingdom were far more complex than any newspaper columnist could ever imagine. The Gilded Cage of Graceland. A heavy strip of black electrical tape sealed the edge of the master bedroom window in March 1973. The southern sun was blazing outside, but inside the room, it was pitch black. The air conditioning unit in the corner hummed at a freezing 55 degrees. Elvis Presley lay in the middle of his custom 8-foot square bed. He wore a pair of dark silk pajamas, his eyes fixed on a small portable television screen showing a silent local news broadcast. Linda Thompson sat on the plush carpet beside the mattress, holding a small silver spoon and a bowl of warm pudding. The fans waiting outside the iron gates pictured Graceland as a non-stop carnival of music, laughter, and endless wealth. They thought the mansion doors opened to a paradise of absolute freedom. But the reality inside those walls was a completely different story. The legendary home was actually a highly functional, frozen prison. What was the daily routine of the most famous house in Tennessee when the cameras were fully turned off? The schedule was completely backward. The household day officially began at 9 o'clock at night. The kitchen staff down on the first floor did not prepare dinners or afternoon snacks. Instead, they stood by the stoves at midnight, frying up massive plates of country sausage, burnt bacon, and eggs to order. Elvis did not walk through the house during the day. He lived almost exclusively within his second-floor suite. He communicated with his staff and his security team through a white intercom system mounted next to his pillow. When he buzzed, the Memphis Mafia members sitting in the downstairs hallway had to run up the carpeted stairs within 30 seconds. If a buzzer went unanswered, Elvis would fire a warning shot from one of his custom handguns straight into the bedroom wall to get their attention. Linda had to learn how to navigate this volatile environment without losing her own sanity. She quickly realized she could not live like a traditional 22-year-old woman. She had to give up her college classes and her pageant travel schedules completely. She adjusted her biological clock to match Elvis's nocturnal patterns. She slept during the bright daylight hours and stayed awake through the freezing nights, sitting on the edge of the bed to keep him company. The isolation began to take a serious toll on her personal relationships. Her mother called the Graceland main office line in 1974, trying to reach Linda for her birthday. The call went straight to the security desk at the front gate. A guard named Jerry West informed her that Elvis was currently sleeping, which meant the entire household was on a strict telephone blackout. Did Linda accept this total cutoff from her family without a fight? The household logbooks from that summer revealed her response. Linda did not argue with the security guards. Instead, she waited until Elvis fell into a deep, drug-induced sleep at 6 o'clock in the morning. She slipped out of the bedroom, walked down the spiral staircase in her bare feet, and used the kitchen wall phone to dial her parents. She kept her voice to a low whisper, her eyes scanning the hallway for any roaming bodyguards. It was a tiny act of rebellion, but it was the only way she could keep a grip on the real world outside the gates. Roy's control over the ranch had been driven by business metrics, but Elvis's control over Graceland was driven by a deep, childlike fear of abandonment. He could not stand to be alone in a room for even 5 minutes. If Linda tried to walk down to the kitchen to grab a glass of water, Elvis would wake up instantly and call out her name. He wanted her constant physical presence. He wanted her to read to him, to watch the television screens with him, and to reassure him that his fame would not fade away. One evening, Linda decided to pack a small bag to visit her brother in Memphis for the weekend. She walked into the master bedroom to tell Elvis she was leaving for 48 hours. Elvis did not get angry or raise his voice. Instead, he walked over to his jewelry cabinet, grabbed a heavy gold ring set with a massive diamond star, and slid it onto her finger. He looked at her and whispered that he had booked an entire floor of a hotel in San Francisco for their upcoming trip. He asked her if she would rather stay with him and see the ocean. Linda looked at the heavy gold ring, then at the tired, pale face of the man standing in the dark bedroom. She slowly set her suitcase back down on the closet floor. The public continued to buy the glossy magazines, showing the glamorous couple smiling in the back of their custom tour buses. They had no idea that the young woman in the photographs was spending her days in a freezing, blacked-out room, managing the fragile emotions of an aging superstar. The gilded cage was secure, and the gates were locked tight. But as the 1970s marched on, the emotional toll of keeping the king safe inside his fortress was about to turn into a terrifying, physical battle for survival. The Silent Guardian. A plastic bottle of liquid sleeping medication rattled against the glass top of a bedside table in June 1975. The penthouse suite of the Las Vegas Hilton was silent. Linda Thompson lay awake in the dark, her heart pounding against her ribs. She was listening. She wasn't listening for a thief or an intruder. She was listening to the rhythmic, heavy rasp of Elvis's breathing. Suddenly, the sound stopped completely. Linda threw back the bed sheets and scrambled across the mattress. The digital clock on the dresser glowed 4:15 in the morning. Elvis was lying on his stomach, his face buried deep into the soft satin pillow. His limbs were completely limp. Linda grabbed his shoulders, using all her strength to roll his heavy frame onto his back. His lips were already taking on a faint, bluish tint under the dim light of the bathroom lamp. She shoved 2 fingers straight into his mouth, pulling his tongue forward to clear his blocked throat. The roaring crowds at the afternoon shows saw an unstoppable dynamo. They saw a man who could command a stage with a single flick of his wrist. But behind the red velvet curtains of the showroom, a terrifying daily battle was playing out. What was the dangerous medical secret the hotel staff and the promoters were desperately trying to hide from the press? The truth lay in the black leather medical bags brought into the hotel through the service elevator. Elvis was no longer just taking pills to sleep. He was trapped in a continuous 24-hour cycle of chemical sedation. His personal physician, Dr. George Nicopolis, routinely checked into the adjoining suite under an assumed name. He carried prescription pads and pre-filled syringes, ready to administer heavy doses of downers to put Elvis to sleep, and powerful stimulants to wake him up for the evening curtain. Linda found herself forced into the role of a full-time, unpaid night nurse. She kept a small, black spiral notebook hidden under her mattress. In it, she logged every single pill Elvis swallowed, down to the exact milligram. She noted the time of his injections. She noted the color of his skin. She quickly learned that she was the only person in the entire entourage who was actually tracking his chemical intake. The Memphis Mafia bodyguards stood outside the heavy double doors, playing cards and drinking beer. They were paid to keep the fans out, not to keep the pills away. In fact, several of the guards were actively helping to procure extra prescriptions from local doctors to keep the king happy. They knew that a sober, irritable Elvis was a man who might fire them on a whim. Linda decided to confront the doctor directly during a rehearsals break in August. She cornered Dr. Nicopolis in the dressing room corridor, holding her black notebook in her hand. She showed him the logged dosages, pointing out that the quantities were enough to stop an athlete's heart. The doctor didn't look her in the eye. He adjusted his glasses, patted her shoulder, and told her that Elvis had a high tolerance. He claimed the medication was necessary to manage his chronic bone pain and glaucoma. Did Linda accept this medical brushing off, or did she take matters into her own hands? She waited until the next afternoon when the suite was empty. She walked into the private bathroom, opened the mirrored cabinet, and grabbed 3 large bottles of liquid sedatives. She walked over to the toilet and poured the thick yellow syrup down the drain. She filled the empty bottles with a mixture of tap water and sweet maple syrup, placing them neatly back on the glass shelf. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. If Elvis noticed the difference, his temper could flare violently. 2 nights later, Elvis reached for one of the watered-down bottles before bed. He drank the mixture, turned off the lamp, and closed his eyes. Within an hour, his breathing remained steady, light, and natural. He didn't choke. He didn't turn blue. For the first time in months, Linda actually closed her eyes and slept for 3 continuous hours. But the victory was short-lived. The physical demands of his touring schedule were growing heavier. The corporate promoters at RCA and the Hilton chain were demanding more dates, more cities, and more shows to pay off the massive debts accumulated by Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker. Elvis was exhausted. His body was swollen with fluid, his kidneys were failing, and his legs were covered in painful deep vein clots. To get him onto the stage, the doctors simply increased the strength of the morning stimulants. Linda watched him stand in front of the full-length mirror in his dressing room, struggling to squeeze his bloated body into a white leather jumpsuit. He was sweating profusely, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't clasp his own belt buckle. He looked at Linda through the mirror's reflection, his eyes glassy and vacant. He asked her if he looked like a king. Linda walked over to him, took the heavy silver buckle from his hands, and fastened it for him. She looked at his pale face and told him he looked beautiful. She knew it was a lie, but she also knew that the truth would completely shatter whatever fragile confidence he had left before the spotlights hit his face. The fans were already screaming his name in the showroom below, unaware that the man they were waiting for was barely holding on to consciousness. The Great Escape. A brown leather suitcase with brass latches lay open on the floral bedspread of the guest bungalow on a freezing afternoon in December 1976. Linda Thompson stood by the dresser. She took a handful of silver pageant trophies, wrapped them in soft white sweaters, and packed them into the corners of the bag. The cold rain beat hard against the window glass, throwing gray shadows across her room. The heavy iron music gates of Graceland were visible through the bare oak trees. To the rest of the world, leaving the side of Elvis Presley was unthinkable. He was the wealthiest, most powerful entertainer alive, capable of buying anything or anyone with a single signature on a personal check. But inside the bedroom, Linda's hands were shaking from pure exhaustion. Her body weight had plummeted, her eyes were constantly bloodshot, and she was barely sleeping more than 90 minutes at a stretch. What was the exact moment she realized she had to walk away from the king to save her own life? The final breaking point didn't happen during a loud, dramatic argument. It happened during a quiet, routine check of his bedside table 3 nights earlier. Linda had opened the drawer to find a fresh, unauthorized shipment of high-dose barbiturates. A local doctor had slipped them into the house through a back entrance while she was downstairs eating dinner. She realized then that she was fighting a war against a massive, invisible network of enablers. The security guards, the traveling entourage, and the corrupt medical personnel were all working to keep Elvis heavily medicated so they could keep drawing their fat weekly salaries. She could watch him 24 hours a day, but she could not stop a multi-million-dollar machine that wanted him to stay quiet and compliant. Linda closed the lid of her suitcase and clicked the brass latches shut. She walked out of the bungalow, crossed the wet grass of the backyard, and went up the spiral staircase to the 2nd floor of the main mansion. Elvis was sitting on the edge of his massive bed. He wore his favorite red silk robe, his hair uncombed, his face pale under the soft yellow lamps. He looked at the car keys in Linda's hand. He didn't ask her to unpack her things. He didn't call for his security guards to block the door. He simply stared at the floor and asked her if she thought he would survive the year without her. How did Linda answer the most terrifying question she had ever been asked? She didn't offer a hollow, comforting lie. She walked over to the bed, sat down beside him, and took his cold hand in her lap. She told him that she loved him, but she was slowly dying alongside him. She explained that she could not watch him destroy himself anymore because her heart was completely broken. Elvis nodded his head slowly. He pressed his face into her shoulder, weeping quietly, and told her she was right to leave the kingdom. It was the most honest human interaction they had shared in 5 years. Linda stood up, walked down the carpeted stairs, and past the gold records lining the hallway. She opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the rain. She started her car, watching the rearview mirror as the iron gate slowly clicked closed behind her. She was finally free from the gilded cage, but the silence in her car felt heavier than any cage she had ever lived in. The broken telephone call. The hard plastic of a cream-colored rotary telephone receiver rattled against the kitchen wall of a small, quiet apartment in Los Angeles on August 16, 1977. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Linda Thompson stood by the white-tiled sink, holding a half-empty glass of iced tea. The condensation on the glass ran down her fingers, dripping onto the linoleum floor. Outside the window, the heavy summer heat rose off the asphalt in waves, distorting the view of the palm trees lining the street. The phone had been ringing continuously for several minutes before she finally decided to reach for it. She expected a call from her modeling agency about a commercial shoot, or perhaps a friend from the Memphis pageant circuit calling to chat. She pulled the heavy cord toward her and pressed the receiver to her ear. Instead of a familiar professional voice, she heard the gasping, hysterical sobbing of 9-year-old Lisa Marie Presley. The little girl was crying so hard, her voice was nearly drowned out by the long-distance static on the line. She was hyperventilating, her words cutting through the receiver like a physical blow. Linda gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, the glass of iced tea slipping from her hand and shattering on the floor. Lisa Marie managed to choke out 5 devastating words through her tears. "Linda, my daddy is dead." The public was currently lining up at record stores and buying morning newspapers, completely unaware of any tragedy. The fans still pictured Elvis preparing for his upcoming multi-city arena tour. They were looking forward to seeing him step back into the spotlight in his high-collared jumpsuits. But inside the upstairs master bathroom at Graceland, the final curtain had already fallen. How did Linda manage to process the worst-case scenario she had spent 5 agonizing years trying to prevent? Her mind did not register panic or rage. Instead, she went completely numb, entering a state of absolute clinical shock. Her voice remained strangely calm, operating on a survival instinct she had developed during her long nights of caretaking. She did not ask for details. She did not scream. She gently told Lisa Marie to put her grandmother, Dee Presley, on the line. Once she hung up the receiver, Linda immediately dialed the private, unlisted number to the Graceland security desk. Joe Esposito, Elvis's longtime road manager and co-director of the Memphis Mafia, answered on the very first ring. His voice was thick, flat, and hollow. He did not offer any hope or try to soften the blow. He confirmed the brutal reality. They had found Elvis unresponsive on the red carpet of his bathroom floor, and the emergency medical team had already pronounced him dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital. Linda slowly lowered herself onto the wet linoleum kitchen's floor, her back pressed against the lower wooden cabinets. She stared at the shards of broken glass and the spilled tea spreading across the tiles. For 5 years, she had sacrificed her own youth, her college education, and her personal ambitions to act as his literal night nurse. She had spent countless nights listening to the rhythm of his breathing, ready to clear his airway at a moment's notice. She had poured his dangerous medications down the toilet, argued with his doctors, and held him through his darkest paranoid episodes. Now, just 8 short months after she had walked out of the music gates to save her own sanity, the unthinkable had happened. The media storm erupted within an hour of her telephone call. Television networks across the country broke into regular programming to announce the sudden passing of the king of rock and roll. The streets of Memphis quickly became completely gridlocked as thousands of weeping fans began gathering along the Fieldstone Wall on Elvis Presley Boulevard. They brought candles, old vinyl albums, and handwritten notes, looking for any shred of information. Linda packed a single black linen dress, a pair of dark sunglasses, and boarded an emergency flight back to Memphis that evening. The flight was a blur of roaring jet engines and silent, suffocating grief. When she arrived at the mansion under the cover of darkness, the driveway was illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of police cruisers. The grand colonial home was filled to capacity with crying relatives, record label executives, and members of the security detail. The atmosphere inside the house was thick with a mixture of sorrow and deep, unspoken guilt. Several of the bodyguards actively avoided making eye contact with Linda as she walked through the front door. They stood in the corners of the living room, staring at their shoes. They knew that she had been the only person willing to stand between Elvis and the enablers. They knew that in her absence, the toxic cycle of prescription drugs had returned with a vengeance, unchecked by anyone on the payroll. Did Linda lash out at the entourage for failing to keep him alive? She did not offer a single word of blame or anger. During a quiet, private conversation with Elvis's grieving father, Vernon Presley, in the back study, she realized that the tragedy was far too vast for simple resentment. The entire system had conspired to bring about this end. The corporate promoters wanted their star on stage regardless of his physical collapse. The fans demanded an immortal superhero who never aged or showed weakness. The entourage wanted to protect their comfortable weekly paychecks. And Elvis himself had simply lost the strength to fight the chemical fog that kept his pain at bay. Vernon sat in his leather armchair, tears streaming down his worn face. He took Linda's hands and thanked her for giving his son 5 extra years of life. He admitted that without her constant vigilance in the mid-70s, the phone call would have come much sooner. Linda stood up and walked up the stairs to the private second floor, a section of the house that was strictly off-limits to the public and most guests. The master bedroom suite was exactly as she had left it in December. The heavy black velvet drapes were still pinned tightly to the window frames, blocking out the Memphis streetlights. The air conditioning unit was still humming loudly, keeping the room at a freezing 55 degrees. But the massive custom bed was empty, and the white intercom system on the nightstand was completely silent. She walked over to the edge of the mattress and stood there in the cold dark. She looked at the small, familiar indentation in the pillow where he used to rest his head. For years, she had lived in terror of this exact silence. She had stayed awake for 48 hours straight on tour, keeping her hand resting gently on his chest to feel the reassuring rise and fall of his lungs. Now, there was no breath left to monitor. She realized then that leaving Graceland had saved her life, but it had not saved her from the pain of his loss. She would carry the heavy weight of this afternoon for the rest of her days. She had been his guardian in the darkest hours of his life, but the lights had finally gone out on the kingdom, leaving behind only the cold artifacts of a manufactured legend and the raw, unvarnished memories of the fragile man she had tried so hard to protect. The legacy. Behind the screen. The key turned in the lock of a glass display case inside the Elvis Presley Museum in Memphis on an afternoon in June 1995. Linda Thompson stood by the exhibit. Adjusting her reading glasses, she reached into the cabinet and carefully lifted a faded black leather notebook from the velvet shelf. The page edges were yellowed and worn, covered in her own tight, handwritten notes detailing drug names, times, and dosages from 1974. Outside the quiet archive room, the muffled sounds of thousands of tourists echoed through the exhibition halls. They walked past the towering walls of gold records, the glittering pink Cadillac, and the high-collared white stage capes. They were searching for the grand, flawless myth of the king. They wanted to believe in the smiling, invincible superhero of their youth. But Linda stood in the quiet of the archives, looking down at the ink of her own 24-year-old handwriting. The public still wanted her to speak exclusively about the romance, the private jets, and the glamorous Hawaiian vacations. But as the years marched on, she realized that maintaining the polished plastic fairy tale was doing a massive disservice to the man she had actually lived with. Why did she decide to donate her private personal journals and medical logs to the archives instead of keeping them hidden in her Los Angeles home? The decision had been sparked by a conversation she had with an archivist named Peter Guralnick earlier that year. The historian had explained that the corporate estate was actively working to sanitize Elvis's history for future generations. They wanted to erase any mention of the prescription pill bottles, the physical collapses, and the heavy emotional isolation. They wanted to package him as a spotless, cartoon-like corporate trademark. Linda realized that erasing his pain also erased the immense courage it had taken for him to wake up and face those screaming crowds every night. She wanted the world to understand the heavy, human cost of the crown he wore. She began giving frank, unvarnished interviews to biographers and documentary crews. She described the quiet, freezing bedroom. She spoke openly about the terror of checking his breathing in the middle of the night and the absolute exhaustion of acting as his primary barrier against a world of enablers. She didn't share these details to tarnish his memory or create cheap tabloid headlines. She did it to rescue his humanity from the commercial monster that had consumed him alive. The corporate estate lawyers were furious about her sudden, raw honesty. They sent a series of stern, formal letters to her attorney, warning her that speaking about his private medical issues could violate her original confidentiality agreements. They threatened to block her royalty payments and lock her out of future collaborative projects. Did Linda back down under the threat of a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate lawsuit? Her actions during the winter of 1996 settled the dispute. Linda did not reply to the lawyers. Instead, she booked an appearance on a national primetime television special. She sat in front of the cameras and spoke directly to millions of viewers. She told the story of the lonely, scared country boy who used to hide his mother's old clothes in his bedroom closet because he couldn't bear to let them go. The fans responded with an overwhelming wave of support and gratitude. The letters that arrived at her home did not contain anger or disappointment. Instead, thousands of ordinary people thanked her for making Elvis feel like a real, three-dimensional human being again. They felt closer to him because they finally understood his private struggles, his weaknesses, and his profound vulnerability. Linda set the black leather notebook back onto the museum shelf and closed the glass door. She walked out of the archive room and stood on the balcony overlooking the front driveway of Graceland. The sun was setting over the tall oak trees, casting long, peaceful shadows across the stone wall. She had survived the gilded cage, lived through the terror of the dark Las Vegas suites, and built a successful life of her own. She had finally freed her memories from the tight grip of the corporate enablers, and she knew she was leaving his true story exactly where it belonged, in the hands of the people who loved the man, not just the myth. The towering walls of gold records and the glittering white jumpsuits are now locked safely behind museum glass. But the true story of Elvis Presley was never written under the warm glow of a stage spotlight. It was lived in the freezing, blacked-out master bedroom of Graceland. It was kept alive by a 22-year-old woman who sat awake for 5 years, checking his chest in the dark to make sure his heart was still beating. Linda Thompson survived the suffocating pressure of his gilded cage. At 76 years old, she has finally chosen to strip away the polished corporate myth. By sharing the raw details of his dependency, his laughter, and his deepest fears, she didn't tarnish his memory. She saved his humanity from the commercial machine that swallowed him whole. Elvis Presley was a legendary icon, but he was also just a fragile Mississippi country boy who was simply too weak to carry the heavy weight of his own crown. Now, the final verdict belongs to you. Does knowing the terrifying personal cost of his fame change the way you hear his music today? Does it make his lonely ballads sound just a little more real? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to uncover the raw human stories behind history's greatest musical legends, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now.